The biggest things we saw in week 12 that will impact the rest of the fantasy season. That's what we're going to talk about on this episode of Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. Want to start real quick this week by wishing everyone a happy Thanksgiving. And as it is around the holidays, Shawn and I, schedules are a little bit different this week. 3 games on Thursday, a game on Friday. Always a different week for the fantasy football content landscape. We're going to record probably 2 episodes today on Wednesday morning. We're coming to you on Wednesday morning. Probably going to try to avoid the teams that are playing on Thanksgiving and on Black Friday. But if we don't, there's a possibility you're hearing this after those teams have played their week 13 games. So just, a little disclaimer at the top. We're going to talk about the things that we saw that we think are interesting. We're not going to necessarily shy away from that. You may have more information than we do by the time that these words reach your ears. But always thankful, Shawn, for our audience. We'd love to talk about that. Bring you in. How are you doing? How is Thanksgiving shaping up for you?
Good. We have had an interesting week over the last 7, 10, 15 days. Get a fortnight in there. And I'm going to be moving back to Kansas City. So in some ways, my Chiefs homerism will not seem so weird. But no, it's great to be heading home. It's also great to be carrying the fantasy football community with me, everybody who is a part of what we do. And so the greater landscape, Ben, that you and I are connected to means a lot to me. Always thinking of them and sort of having that in the background as a boost as you go through some of these stressful but exciting life events. So it's been exciting to go through all of this. It's been exciting to watch the games. Week 12, a lot of teams on a bye, but some fantastic football. I was joking with you before the show that I've definitely tried to shoehorn Jordan Addison into some lineups through the season. In week 12, with the buys, he was necessary some places, but we've got a lot of pretty strong teams and a lot of depth to where his 30-point game mostly came on the bench. That's both exciting and endlessly frustrating, but a great reality football week. We did fail to clinch the top seed in one of our main events because Anthony Richardson does not throw accurate passes. That's all information we had, right? So we went into that knowing we have a team that we'll probably talk a little more length about kind of as we go through or on a separate episode, where we've continued to stash a lot of interesting quarterbacks. There are a lot of interesting quarterbacks out there who are not necessarily always scoring quarterbacks or very inconsistently scoring. And so if the rest of your team is elite, you're trying to figure out how you can use those roster spots to potentially end up with a diamond in the end. And part of what you're hoping to do is, buy some time, gain more information. As you're gaining information, you do have to play players. Unfortunately, Ben, and I take a lot of responsibility for this on our team, where we have like half the team is quarterbacks. The last 2 weeks, we've had a lot of QB scoring on the bench, almost none in the starting lineup. This was a weird league where there were 5 teams that were like almost in the exact same spot. So heading into week 11, we were in 5th, which basically means that we didn't have either the top 2 records or either the next 2 spots in points. Heading into week 12, we were in 1st, and we had a chance to not only win, but to clinch the bonus for having the most points and the best record. We ended up finishing 3rd again because, and this is maybe a little bit of a misconstruing of what actually happened. But Anthony Richardson threw what to my mind was a targeted pass on Sunday where he was called for intentional grounding. I don't know that I've ever, you see these miscommunication between receivers and their quarterbacks where you get an intentional grounding call, someone cuts, the pass goes out to the sideline. I don't know if I've ever seen one where I did feel like he was trying to throw it to someone. The ball ends up 20 yards away. You get intentional grounding because he's in the pocket. There's a little bit of pressure. That's a pretty inaccurate pass then. Again, knew all of that going into the game and putting him in the starting lineup. So you got to take your own responsibility for taking that risk. It didn't pay off, but so many of the things did. And week 12 had some fun football.
Well, I will say a lot of thoughts there to the idea that you should take responsibility for. we do have 4 quarterbacks on this team. We have Anthony Richardson, Tua Tagovailoa, Drake May, CJ Stroud. Those are the interesting but not always scoring quarterbacks that Shawn referenced. We've played the lowest scoring of the 4 for each of the final 2 weeks, and we failed to get the auto bid to the sprint by 7 points total. So you can imagine that it's not ideal in our our feelings. To the idea that you would take responsibility for that. I mean, you would also have to take responsibility for the 2 teams that do have the auto bid, that are the 1 seeds overall. I believe both were sweeps. And then also in the Fantasy Pros, we have a 1 seed that was a sweep. We have 10 teams.
Got the
10 teams together, 5 main events, 5 Fantasy Pros teams. 4 of those 10s got auto bids. Shawn's focusing on the 5th that also could have gotten auto bid. When I say auto bid, that means you either got the number 1 win-loss record or the most points, which is the number 2 seed, and you don't have to play in the FFPC League playoffs, which run weeks 13 and 14 to advance to the shootout, the sprint that we're always talking about for the big prize, which is weeks 15 to 17, where you play against people from all sorts of different leagues. If you get the 3 or the 4 seed, you do advance to your league's playoffs, where there's a separate prize as well. If you're able to win both weeks 13 and 14, you can win like a wild card ticket. So this team that Shawn referenced that finished as the 3 seed and didn't get the auto bid, the 1st and 2nd seed automatically go to the shootout in every league. A 3 or 4 seed that goes on to win the league championship in week 14 by winning that little 4-team bracket in weeks 13 and 14 will also advance. And so we still have a path with this team, but what's really cool is you got to be one of the top 2 teams to get these auto bids. And we have 2 other main events out of 5 that are in. Potentially we'll get 3 into the sprint out of 5. I mean, you have 5 teams. There's 12 in each league. Our expectation should be slightly less than 1, right? Or slightly less than 1. 1 out of every 6 teams would get in. And then we have 5 Fantasy Pros teams. We got 2 auto bids. We have some teams that are actually really bad on the other end of the spectrum. So you could say that we got a little bit fortunate with some of the ways that our player exposures pieced together. We've talked about the Kittle Bowers tandem that we did in multiple leagues that really went beneficial. This team that finished 3rd is a McBride Bowers. But yeah, the way that we go about it every week, Shawn, you're on top of it. You get all the lineup set. I always end up sending you a Sunday morning message with sort of the things that I'm thinking through. I look at all of them as well on my end. We played, I think, not the necessarily like the clear obvious quarterback, but certainly the one that was the highest projected both of the 2 weeks. So it's not like you were solely making these quarterback decisions by any means. And you do an awesome job throughout the year of getting the lineup set, of getting all of these, getting our initial waiver claims in, all of these things, the backbone of our in-season stuff. And then I'm just bouncing ideas off you when I see them. So anyway, you would have to take a lot of credit for a lot of really sharp decisions. The Addison thing also really funny because you've had some other sharp upside plays throughout the season. But yeah, Addison's one that you have pigeonholed into some lineups. And now the way that I look at it is, look, it validates the process, right? He has a 30-point game on the bench later after we've given up on it. And it's like, okay, well, this is why you kept wanting to get him in the lineup every week when it was borderline insane. At this point, there was no way he could still be in the lineup, but he was on the bench for this team as well. Jaden Reed was in the lineup, for example. Jameson Williams was in the lineup. If somehow we had Addison in and over like one of those guys, Tank Dell was in the lineup, none of them scored well. The 3 receivers that we played, because we had McBride and Bowers, and so we're flexing a tight end as well. 2 flexes in this league. Bucky Irving on this team, Kyron Williams. It's a really fun team. Jamar Chase on a bye as well. And there's several things that also could have happened. We end up losing. You mentioned we could have won the 1 seed. We end up losing that head-to-head in part because we played against Saquon and we got crushed in the head-to-head, and that's fine. The guy was the highest scorer in the league, or the second highest scorer in the league. We weren't going to be able to win that. But even if we lost the head-to-head, we would still have advanced on a tie break of points scored for the 1 seed, best win-loss. If the other team that we were tied with for the best win-loss also lost, they win by 11. Had a bunch of players on Monday Night Football. 2 of them were Lamar Jackson and Rashad Bateman. That bomb 40-yard TD to Bateman. I mean, Bateman's had several games.
But the defender is right there. Knock the ball away.
He's committing a penalty. Just commit the penalty, and then the yards don't count. I mean, let somebody else score the short touchdown. It was maddening. I threw my hands up. I was frustrated. It was a reminder that things don't always break your way. We have had some stuff break our way, but they go on. That team goes on to win by 11 points with Lamar, with Bateman, with Disley, who could have, had a down game, and he didn't have a great game, but in tight end premium gets double digits. Had Tucker in that game as well. He nails a long field goal. He's been missing everything lately. There were several ways where it's like, well, if these players don't smash this 4-player combo, this team could lose and we would still get an auto bid with the 1 seed. And then the third element was the most points, which is a team that didn't factor into the best win-loss situation. They, going into Monday night, needed 7 from Derrick Henry, got 14. To pass us. We didn't have any players on Monday night, but that's why we ended up losing by 7 in the total points category. And then you go back and you look at the quarterback decisions and all these things. The point of that story that I'm saying is
other quarterbacks would have worked.
Right. The point of that story that I'm saying is I'm sure a lot of our listeners do this too. You can beat yourself up 12 different ways. The specifics of everything I just said. Any other quarterbacks would have worked. We have a bunch of quarterbacks on the team. Sometimes you have to just accept that the results are going to be what they're going to be, and you can't live in the past, and you can't deal with the frustration. We still, again, to recap, top line.
Should Ogletree have caught that touchdown?
Drew Ogletree, yeah, hit him right in the hands. I was like, man, this guy literally gets 2 targets a year. This is your only you got to catch that one, bud. You're never going to get the ball again. I mean, he's had some touchdowns in the past in his career. That was the Richardson comment. Anyway, the top line thing, Shawn. 2 of our 5 teams, auto bids, 1 or 2 seeds, regular season payouts, awesome stuff. People have asked sort of what those teams look like. On a Signals Gold recently, one is a Bijan Chase Brown team. Obviously, the running backs are what matter. We have all the other stuff looking good. Kittle, Bowers, JSN's on a lot of these teams. This one has Kupp and Higgins. That's one of the auto bid teams, but it has Bijan and Brown. The other one is a Kenneth Walker, Devon Achane team where we got Tracy late and we've been able to play 3 running backs: Justin Jefferson, Ladd McConkey. It's a Jordan Addison, Jaden Reed, Jerry Jeudy team. A bunch of receivers that can sit on the bench on the team because it's another Kittle Bowers team. Those are the 2 mains that we send. We're still hoping that we can get this team that didn't get the auto bid through. It would be nice and will be nice to get a McBride team through. I feel confident. We're down to the 3 seed, but we're projected to score the most points this week over all 4 of the playoff teams, and we're projected to win our matchup by 15 points. There's no guarantees there, just using the site's projections. But there's the possibility that we will advance. This team is not relying on players who have week 14 buys either. So there's multiple things that we can feel pretty good about. In terms of if we're able to win this week, being able to win in week 14. One of the other teams is a Lamar team on the other matchup. So if they win and we get to meet them in the finals, they will be hitting some week 14 buys. We still have a path to get this third main event team through. I'm optimistic about this team as well. Some fun teams. Again, we had Jamar Chase on a bye last week, so we get him back for the league playoffs. Some fun teams in our FFPC portfolio. Excited about them.
It would be heartbreaking to have a Jamar Chase, Trey McBride team that was right there and has QB upside despite who we've actually played. Then a franchise record 12 tight end receptions for Trey McBride last week. This kind of goes without saying, but Kyler Murray completed 24 passes. For most of the game, he had more than 50% of the Arizona Cardinals receptions.
Yeah, I mean, I in the offseason, I remember and this is not a specific victory lap I've taken, so I'm going to go ahead and take it now. I remember making the specific case multiple places that McBride was going to out target and out receive Marvin Harrison, was sort of the bold prediction there. Obviously, we were very high on McBride. We weren't necessarily playing Harrison, and that was my explanation for like why, like how to think through those two ADPs. The reason I bring this up is I actually checked in on that this week because of the 12 receptions. Harrison's played every game, although he, I believe, maybe left one early, or I can't remember the specifics. McBride missed a game, right? He's only played 10. McBride has 80 targets. Harrison has 66, and McBride's catch rate is more than 20% percentage points higher. 61 receptions to 36. He's not just slightly out receiving him. Obviously, higher ADOT and all of those things play into it, but he's not just slightly out receiving him. When you think about their ADPs and their prices and everything, feel pretty good about that. Harrison's got 36 catches at this point in the season. Michael Wilson has 32. James Conner has 29. In terms of how you rank the Cardinals offense, Harrison's going to need to get going. He still has the potential to be a late season bloomer and a big part of fantasy playoffs, but going to need to get going here soon. Didn't have a great game. Let's talk about the games. That was
but as long as we're on McBride, I think it's worth pointing out too that where there is still additional upside. We did the thing a couple of weeks ago where we sort of joked about how long he was open in the end zone on a designed play to get him a touchdown where Kyler Murray never threw it to him. He was wide open in the end zone on back-to-back plays in this game, the first of which Murray didn't see him, and the second of which he threw the ball again almost into the stands.
Yeah.
So it's tough for them to convert those, but certainly while we do give Kyler Murray a hard time, he's not such a bad quarterback that at some point you wouldn't expect a little bit of a touchdown hot streak that could be very beneficial for both players, because Kyler Murray, if he could get some passing touchdowns, would be a lot better for fantasy as well.
There was a point a few weeks ago we were saying Trey McBride's never going to score because the ways they were using him, it's just like he wasn't going to be a part of the red zone packages. The game prior to the bye and this last game have made it, I think, very clear that he's gonna catch a touchdown this year. Like they are aware. Trey McBride is aware that he has not caught a touchdown, right? He's very aware of it.
Well, he did the whole hand on the hips kind of pose for the crowd after the second consecutive of those plays where the ball was thrown way over his head. And then, because he's not a complete and total jerk, did seem to quickly realize, okay, wait, I need to go like encourage my quarterback instead of the opposite way, and sort of sprints off over to the sideline and is, back to being, I mean, one of the things that's fun about him is, vaguely similar to Baker Mayfield, who would like to throw a pass and then run 50 yards down the field and spring the touchdown scoring block after he's thrown the pass. McBride gets in there with his teammates when they're doing good stuff, and that's what you like to see.
Yeah. He definitely does. The Mayfield thing is funny. Lamar had a moment like that on Monday night where he completed a pass to Zay Flowers, I think over the middle, and Flowers is kind of weaving toward the sideline and ends up going out of bounds. And there's a teammate there, and I realize it's Lamar. And I'm like, you just threw from the pocket 15 yards downfield. And then, Zay kind of ran laterally. But by the time he got over to the sideline and got out of bounds, you were all the way 25 yards downfield next to him for some reason, just taking off to go run and high-five him. No, McBride had the most hilarious game of the week. We definitely should talk about him more. You brought up the end zone stuff. He had a really funny and embarrassing moment early on where on a third down, he got to the sticks, caught a pass over the middle, and really turtled over top of it to clearly catch it. And then they, ruled that he gave himself up. There's no defender there. He really could have just rolled over. They ruled that he gave himself up. He gets up, he points for a dramatic first down. And then they mark the ball short and they punt on 4th and 1. They don't go for it. He thought he was a yard further past the sticks. He was ruled to have not gotten to the sticks, even though he did the dramatic point. A little while later, he didn't get out of bounds in the 2-minute drill. And then the next play got a block in the back. That was a tough play. You talked about the end zone stuff. There was some meat left on the bone in a game where he otherwise was their whole offense. They ran the ball 14 times for 49 yards in this game. It was a very, very pass-heavy game, but you mentioned Kyler barely completed that many balls. They had one 30-yard completion to Michael Wilson, one 22-yard completion to Marvin Harrison. Those guys combined for 101 yards. James Conner gets 41 receiving out of the backfield. The rest of the offense has 10 receiving yards. McBride has 133 receiving yards, 12 catches, 15 targets, a ton of block and release stuff, but also not just low ADOT. Like when we talk about like David Njoku, he'll often have like an 8 out of like 3 or even lower sometimes. JSN on the other side of this game, who we should talk about, had an 8 out of, I think, sub 2 in this game, has a nice receiving day. And I actually took that as a very positive for him. McBride gets 15 targets. So the average depth is going to be brought down a little bit. A lot of those were short targets, block and release. You got to think about that. But he had 90 air yards. They weren't all just at the line of scrimmage. Several of these 12 receptions were in the intermediate range. And that's the other reason, not just the way that he's been open in the end zone at the goal line, but that's the other reason I've gotten more optimistic about his TD potential is it was a 6 ADOT overall, 15 targets, 90 air yards. 6 ADOT feels low. It's not a 3 ADOT like in Njoku. It is 90 total air yards. There are, some 15-yard pass plays in addition to all these plays that are within 5 yards downfield, because he did catch a lot of the really short ones, but he adds yak on those, right? He ends up with 133 yards on the 12 receptions, averaging more than 10 yards, comfortably more than 10 yards per reception. That's nice. I mean, it's not like a Zach Ertz line where he had 8 targets for 38 yards for Washington Commanders this week. You're talking about efficiency on these targets as well, and not just a high catch rate, but the yak efficiency. But then really what I'm trying to emphasize is those intermediate routes are there, and he makes those plays too. I mean, he's very capable of that.
And when they get him into that intermediate sort of sideline area, when they get him between the levels of zone coverage, he then rises up, high points the ball. We were kind of joking before the show about some receivers who are definitely letting the ball play them. It's great to see what he's able to do at the catch. Ben, you mentioned their decision to not go for it there, which, I mean, it's tough, right? Because the Cardinals, despite having a mobile quarterback, he's probably not in the mold of an elite sneak type of quarterback. And then you bring in these types of plays where the mobility for a short yardage play is going to maybe be a little bit more out on the edge. And while that introduces a lot of upside, there's also some risk with it. I thought their decision to not go here, which again, they don't know that their offense at that point in the game is going to basically be stuck in neutral and never score anything. But the decision to not go contrasted with the decision of the Ravens playing this really high profile game in the Harbaugh brothers battle. The Ravens going deep in their own territory and going multiple times in, what objectively are somewhat tricky situations, and running some plays in those situations that show a lot of foresight and planning and ability to maximize the highest leverage plays in the game. I thought that those contrasts were pretty compelling, and certainly ones where, again, some of this is simply going to be hindsight, but the teams that were aggressive succeeded and the teams that made the more cowardly choice failed. I also thought, and again, this is kind of a third piece that runs parallel to these things, and again, there's so much hindsight involved with it. When you're the home team and the better team and you score to potentially tie at the end, you're thinking overtime benefits us. 2-point conversions are a coin flip process. But Jaden Daniels has looked like the guy in this game. He's scrambled again. He is on a dominant run, and your kicker is massively struggling. Go get the win right there. That was my thought immediately. You're very nervous during the extra point if you're rooting for more time for your fantasy players. Certainly if you're a Commanders fan, you're nervous. And I mean, they don't even get close to executing that extra point. In all three situations, I think, no guts, no glory. And there was no glory for the teams that decided to take the more conservative route.
Great points. Yeah, the extra point there, he had already missed one in the game. He already missed a field goal. Like you said, he's been struggling. It wasn't even one of those ones where you're like, oh, he might miss this. It was right off the foot. Oh, he missed it, right? Like, I mean, he just shanks, not not a total shank, but he just completely pulled that kick.
And again, it illustrates that there are 3 different things that can go wrong. And you have to go back to the percentages. The percentages include the fact that there are 3 different things that can go wrong. But the snapper has to execute, the holder has to execute, and the kicker has to make the kick. The snapper had a terrible snap, but it seemed like the holder made a miraculous grab to more or less get it down. But when the kicker is seeing all of that unfold, even if the holder gets it down, they're thrown off.
Yeah, they're not seeing the ball till late is a big part of it too, right? I mean, it's not just that they're thrown off, but yeah, if it's a clean catch and hold, they're kicking a ball. I think on a lot of those bad snaps, the kickers have talked about, like, they have to kind of kick to a spot, and sometimes it ends up working, but sometimes you just miss because the ball's not down until right before your foot comes through the kicking zone. Yeah, that was a bummer. That was after the Commanders had a miraculous 86-yard touchdown with like 40 seconds remaining. This game winds up 34-26. Cowboys run back the ensuing onside kick after the missed extra point that would have tied it. It was, can't remember how, it was 10-9 going into the fourth. It was with like 7 minutes left. I think it was 13-9. And you got all of this at the end of the game. Touchdown, 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 field goal, punt, touchdown, touchdown. All happens in the final 5 minutes and 16 seconds was the time of the first touchdown that pushed it to 20-9. It ends up a 34-26 game. Just a frantic end. Like Cowboys Commanders game. I'm sure most people have seen how that went down. I heard it was an exciting thing to watch on Red Zone. For those of you who watch Red Zone, I'm sure it was. I mean, that was crazy. Cowboys score. Commanders score relatively quickly. Cowboys run back the kick. Commanders get down into field goal range, hold Cowboys to a punt, score that 86-yard TD. Cowboys run back another kick, the onside kick. Insane. But yeah, no, Daniels looked great. That's a good one. I mean,
suggested that we should get rid of the kicks for a wide variety of reasons. And I think the Austin Eckler injury is another good example of that. At the same time, the Convate Turpin touchdown is why we have special teams. That was one of the coolest plays you'll ever see.
Yeah, that was awesome. You referenced the go for it situation in Ravens Chargers. I just wanted to comment on that. Troy Aikman really didn't understand it, thought it was crazy aggressive. I want to comment on the time because they did it with about 2 minutes to go in the first half where they were deep in their own in their own area. Essentially, I think what they were thinking is if they punt there, they're giving away really good field position and almost the certainty that the Chargers have the ball last in the half where they're able to move down and potentially kick a field goal or score a touchdown. And they're starting at probably their own 40 or something. So it's not that hard to even get into field goal range. The likelihood of, if you're looking at like this is one of the things that expected points added as a stat tries to accomplish. And I'm not a huge fan of EPA, but it tries to look at the expected points of the drive coming back. And so if they punt there, the Chargers have an expected points of a reasonable expected points on the drive coming back. And because of the time, those last possessions of each half are super important. The Ravens probably don't get another possession. And so it's, a 3-point field goal that you don't get an answer. If the Ravens fail there, the Chargers are going to have to score much quicker, actually. And the Ravens are going to get another possession. If they score a touchdown right away, because they're close, the Ravens actually now have the opportunity to get down into field goal range. And you have a 7-3 trade-off, a net of +4 for the Chargers. If the Ravens hold the Chargers to a field goal, because you're giving them the ball in field goal range, but you're already in the red zone, right? So you're already in this shrunk field area where you're going to have to get that stop, kind of put up, shut up time, whatever. If they get that field goal, there's still going to be enough time for you to go down and answer and get a field goal. And now it's 3-3, it's net 0, theoretically. I think the time on the clock was the biggest reason they did that, was they're thinking, well, this gives us the last possession in almost every scenario, whereas punting probably takes away our opportunity for last possession. And if we convert it, we also have last possession. And they end up throwing that bomb touchdown to Rashad Bateman. And that's the other thing about that play you were talking about. It's so well covered, and we didn't want him to score. It's right before half. Where's the safety? What are you doing? There's 40 seconds in the half.
Well, certainly as someone who's rooting against the Baltimore Ravens scoring points in that game, you're like, just punt. Just punt.
Just punt.
Punt.
Even though my point is Troy Aikman couldn't understand why they would go for it so deep in their own area. And I think in some of those situations, I understand why the old school thinking is that way. I think in this situation, when you think about the clock for like 2 seconds, for all the reasons I just said, last possession being so important in the half and at the end of the game, it's very clear. I think it's very obvious why they went for it, because you still have the possibility of converting, which they showed. And Joe Buck brings it back up in the second half of this game and references it. They made that really bold decision, and that's why they won. It's like, no, it's not a bold decision. This is simple math at this point. Like, it's not a bold decision.
And I think it is then combined with this element of you had a play that was going to definitely work, or you had a play that had a very high likelihood of working. And I think that the combination of tactics and play calling, preparation, readiness. I mean, one of the things that we saw, again, for anybody who's playing Nico Collins, to your endless frustration, is that the Texans, when they actually do have a pass play dialed up, their players are not executing the pre and immediate post snap rules, right? I have become obsessed, probably to a fault, with the number of possessions in games, because so many teams are more or less just soaking the clock at this point. And so I do enjoy, when I'm writing the Monday article specifically, but just also for my own interest, going through and looking at post game, having watched all the games and having a sense of it, but like, how many possessions were there in these games? We were talking about one the other day, had 13, right? The Cowboys Commanders won it in part because of these crazy plays, but had 31. You hear so much in the NBA, and now it's finally kind of going into college basketball, where teams are trying to play 2-on-1 situations or 2-for-1 situations. As you just described it, imagine the benefits of that in a football game that basically has no possessions. Certainly by contrast to a basketball game, I mean, the magnitude of what you can accomplish with appropriate end of the half tactics is pretty meaningful.
It's massive. It is absolutely massive to get the last possession in the half and in the game. For anyone who really, really loves these specific conversations, I wrote about 5,500 words in the intro to part 1 this week about play sequencing and a lot of these interlocking concepts, and talked a lot about it. It was one of my favorite intros of the year to write.
That is 5,500 words a lot. I mean, that is like 5% of the way to a novel.
Yeah, it's a lot of words. I talked a little bit about some of the I talked a little bit about my UW Huskies, some of the stuff they did last year, some of the stuff they've done wrong this year, as a setting to go into the Texans, which is who I really broke down. And much to similar to your point, I see that football is a game of possessions. We've used that phrase on the show a ton. I went through each of the Texans' possessions in a game where they only gave Joe Mixon 14 carries, but basically all of them were situations where they were pulling on CJ Stroud's reins and trying to prevent him from getting into any kind of a rhythm. I felt like it was a weird game where they had a really high pass rate over expected. They didn't actually run the ball a whole lot. And yet every non-obvious pass down, they seemed to be running and trying to establish the run. Like, it was their priority, was to get the run game going, which has been their priority all year. Anyway, if you're curious for how I can justify that a 14 carry, high pass rate over expected game was actually one where the team ran too much, there's several thousand words over there that you can read about it. It was not a great game for the Texans. And I think Bobby Slowick has done a poor job overall this season after a great year last year, which is so interesting. He got a bunch of head coaching opportunities and really prioritized CJ Stroud last season. They trade for Mixon. They signed him to an extension, and they have treated the offense like it needs to be the San Francisco 49ers offense, where Slowick's background comes from. Run the ball, and CJ Stroud can be Brock Purdy and do play action and these things. But they even call play action on obvious passing downs, which is one of the things that drives me a little bit nuts. It's 2nd and long, it's 3rd and long, and then they're calling a play action, and he has to speed up the whole process. The play where he ends up throwing a pick early in the second half, he underthrows Nico Collins a little bit. It's a play action call on a 2nd and 10 because they ran on first. And right when he's making the fake, the pocket is already collapsing. He has to step up in the pocket. Everything is rushed. He ends up leaving it a little bit short as he's moving his momentum toward the line of scrimmage. You got to peel it back so you don't chuck it over Collins' head. That underneath defender makes a really nice play, outstretched interception. If he gets it over that player's head, Nico's got a catch and run and a great opportunity. Part of the issue for that type of a play, I mean, there was actually like 2 minutes left in the third quarter. It was his second drop back of the second half because it came out at halftime prioritizing running the ball, in their first possession of the second half, and then to start their next possession. And then it's, okay, Stroud, go figure it out on a pass down. We're going to call a play action that they're not going to bite on. They're just going to collapse the pocket, and you got to speed up your whole process and figure it out and make a good throw. It's not to completely absolve CJ Stroud because he does make a bad throw on the play, but it's those types of things that I spent 5,500 words talking about, where I do think there is nuance with some of these quarterbacks not playing well. Caleb Williams is another one that I referenced in there, Sean. We talked a little bit about his situation. I do think some of these quarterbacks are really hurt by play sequencing and poor coaching and poor coordinator jobs, that they're not helping them by getting them easy throws, early down passes, those types of things. So, yeah, we should talk about some players as well. I don't want to go too deep into that because I won't come back out. But that game was very fascinating. You mentioned some of the players letting the ball play them, as you were talking about McBride going up and high pointing it. I will just throw out the Quentin Johnston take from our pre-show for anyone who's curious what we think about Quentin Johnston, because he's had some touchdowns and some things. I wrote up a couple weeks ago, was pretty frustrated actually in the game where he last scored a touchdown, that he only caught 2 of 8 passes, because on a lot of those plays, they were deep sideline shots. He's pretty open and he doesn't go get the football, and the defender's able to knock it away at the last minute. This was that Cincinnati Bengals game 2 weeks ago. He has 8 targets, only 2 catches, and he's basically running down the sideline and just putting his hands out there and waiting for the ball to drop into him when he's this big physical wide receiver. I compared to you pre-show that it's like Tyler Lockett, except Tyler Lockett also had this skill where he'd do the late hands thing, right? He doesn't put his hands out until at the very last minute. Quentin Johnston's just running down the sideline with his hands out like this is where the ball is going to drop in. And the defender, who's not even watching the play a lot of the times, like, okay, well, I'm just going to put my hand right above your hands, which is why they do the late hands, so that you can't do that. Defender tipped away several of those passes against the Bengals. We saw similar, not the tip away thing, but similar, as you called it, letting the ball play him in his 5-target, 0-catch game against the Ravens. Multiple passes that he's kind of trying to body catch. He's just not a very skilled receiver at the catch point. He's incredibly athletic, but the nuance and skill of the position, and he gets wide open too. I mean, and they're dialing stuff up for him. That short drag route where they had him wide open, he had so much room to run out the back end. I saw some people on Twitter point out that like Ladd McConkey's open on the second level. Ladd gets open after Herbert's like already started his throwing motion, and he's waiting from the start of that play for Quentin Johnston to clear Ladd's route, which is coming to the middle. There's a little bit of a mesh in the middle of the field. 2 Ravens defenders run into each other. He's waiting for Quentin Johnston, who wins on his route on the left side of the formation, to clear the traffic in the middle, and he's going to be wide open. And he starts to throw it before McConkey even gets open. That comment that Herbert could have thrown to McConkey was absurd, in my opinion. He throws it to Quentin Johnston, wide open in the flat. It's right on the money. And Quentin Johnston just flat drops it. The play's worked beautifully. You've created this traffic over the middle. You have a drag route. You're not even making that one a complicated catch for him. It's a very short catch. And he's big and athletic. You don't even have to do these deep throws that I was talking about didn't work 2 weeks ago. And he just flat drops it. It's a 25-yard gain. Anyway, he's not very good at football. Any good players that you want to talk about?
Well, while we're on the Chargers, we probably have to discuss for a moment the running back situation. Gus Edwards came back from injury in week 10 and looked explosive on a limited number of touches. The past 2 weeks, it's become very clear that was a mirage. It's also become clear that the Chargers don't really want to play him, even though they've put him out there early in games. I think in some cases appropriately, maybe a little bit of deference to, what they had promised him bringing him in, and, how they feel about him as a player in person. But he really can't play. Hassan Haskins really can't play. And it's both from a production perspective when they get touches, but also what the team is signaling to us by the fact that they play a lot. And if J.K. Dobbins is not there, they opt not to use the running backs. This one is so heartbreaking because this game, maybe for the first time since weeks 1 and 2, J.K. Dobbins looked like his pre-injury self in the first half.
Yeah.
Now, he had the big play at the end of the Bengals game to win the game. Obviously, some people feel like he should have gone down, but that was a big time run. He has not looked like himself for most of the year, even though he's a good fit for this offense and has really helped them simply by being able to do multiple things, being a viable running back whom you can hand the ball to and someone who is successful in the receiving game. And then in the first half against the Ravens, they look like they're going to win this game and control the game, in part because this Ravens defense, which is very stout against the run, can't do anything against the pass. I mean, one of the reasons that Quentin Johnston had the chance to, unfortunately make all of those bad plays is that you can get wide open play after play after play against the Ravens pass defense. But the balance that they were able to have in the first half and the way that Dobbins was able to make guys miss and explode in space against a run defense that is still very, very good. I mean, it was the most excited I've been about him and his chances since week 2. And just so heartbreaking that he would go out. Ben, as we're recording, I don't have a good feel for what the outlook is for him.
They just called it a knee sprain this morning. They've called it week to week at this point. It doesn't sound like there's going to be structural issues. Obviously, it's heartbreaking for Dobbins, as you said. I mean, this guy has had all these injury issues. But to your point about how good he looked on one of our other sweats from Monday night, one of those Fantasy Pros teams needed like 5.3 from Dobbins to wrap up the auto bid, whatever it was. And I remember, having that in the back of my mind, but being like, there's a possibility he could miss that, but probably not. He catches some passes. Like I mentioned, Henry, we needed Henry under 7 in another one. And I was saying to you, well, if he doesn't catch any balls, which he didn't in this game, and he doesn't sometimes, and if he just has a game where he doesn't score any TDs, this is a tough defense near the goal line, and he didn't. It's a possibility he can go under 70 rush yards.
He should go 65 yards, especially when the team has gone pass heavy a variety of times.
And he's done that in games. They talked about how he did just in the prior game, 60-something yards, but he had a touchdown in that one. Anyway, he has 140 yards. He clears that easy. But for Dobbins to go under 5.2 or 5.3 or whatever felt a little bit harder because he's going to catch a pass or two always. He plays on all their pass downs, which we'll get to as it relates to like his, missing time now. He looked so good early in that game. And I was thinking in my head, I hope he gets this early so we don't have to sweat it. He caught multiple passes early. He's actually showing some rushing efficiency as well, as you said. And so like to get to 5.5 points, if you catch a couple passes, you need some yardage efficiency still, but you only need like 35 total yards or something. You get a couple bursts in a couple runs and you're going to get there. He got there easily. I think he got there in the first quarter. And then he gets hurt right before half. And you're like, man, I mean, I guess I am glad that he looked so great in this game and went out there and it looks like he got 7.9 points in the first half, 3 catches for 19, 6 carries for 40, which is, 6.5 plus yards per carry, had a 17-yard carry in there, had an 11-yard catch, was making some plays, and then he gets hurt. And that is just devastating for him, somebody who's obviously dealt with a lot of that. Hopefully, it is just a minor knee sprain. Hopefully, he's able to come back relatively quickly. The Chargers look like they're going to be playing in the playoffs. Hopefully, he's able to play in the playoffs, right? Hopefully, this is something minor. We do want to say, that's such a bummer for him as a person because it is something where it's like, I know I felt for me a little bit. You're like, man, this sucks. Like a lot of us in the fantasy community obviously are aware of Dobbins' injury history, and it's not like we were almost waiting for it. But you're aware there's a possibility that he's not going to make it through a full season healthy. It's happened a lot. It's still a bummer, right? I mean, I don't want to gloss over that. It's really, really tough for him. He's having a great year. He's almost about to set his total career high for yards from scrimmage. He's over 900 yards from scrimmage. His rookie season, he had over 900. He didn't hit 1,000. He basically hasn't played enough to have anything close to that in the other years. He's hopefully gets back and he gets over 1,000, has his first career 1,000-yard season. He deserves it. He's had a great year. I mean, it's awesome to see what he's been able to do. To your point about the other backs, after he leaves, I was going to come to Stealing Signals and write about how Kamani Vidal, the opportunity is sort of passed and he kind of missed his window and he didn't really make any noise, etc. I don't know what else the Chargers can do. Maybe they just won't use the backs. Maybe there'll be some interesting things. It was interesting to hear you say that, like, they just don't use the backs, which is a good point. Going into this game, Hassan Haskins had one very, very limited role, which was short yardage. And we had talked about how he'd been poor at that. In the first half of this game, before Dobbins goes out, They put Gus Edwards in a fullback alignment, motioned out the halfback, and then gave it to Gus Edwards on a short yardage. I think it was a 4th down conversion play that he got. Late in the game, they also gave him a goal line carry under 2 minutes before their onside kick when they needed to get a quick touchdown, not running more clock, and he converted that as well. Edwards has not been getting the short yardage, oddly enough. Haskins got 3 goal line carries the week prior, and then they brought in Dobbins on 4th down, and he converted it after Haskins got stuffed 3 times in a row. Those 2 plays to me indicated that Haskins actually lost the one small role that he had, that they had, especially the fullback alignment thing, which is something that Haskins has gotten a lot of, that he's a special teams player, right? But he had, failed enough times in short yardage that they took away that role. He does actually wind up leading this backfield in snaps in this game because after Dobbins goes out, the other side of the equation is Edwards, and you'd think Edwards would play a lot more. He finishes at 23% of the snaps, Sean, in a game where he was playing in the first half meaningfully as well. Got some carries, got that short yardage play that I mentioned, played a little bit in the second half, but they basically are like, we can't play him on any down other than a clear running play because we don't trust him in any other responsibility. And we know that we'll be tipping to the defense on any play that he's on the field that we're going to run the ball. So he only gets to 23% snaps in a game where the whole second half is available to him. Haskins plays 43% of the snaps, touches the ball once. Not only did he not get the short yardage, when he had to get back out there, to your point, they didn't give the ball to the running back. When he's on the field, they're tipping to the defense. We're not going to use the running back. We're not going to give him the football. They've taken away Haskins' one limited offensive role. He had run 3 routes all season coming into the game. He runs 10 in this game because Edwards is the only other active running back. And what else are you going to do? Which all comes back to Kamani Vidal. There's Kamani Vidal's music.
I think it's important, as you described that there too, to point out that, this is fluky. I'm not saying this is how it would go every time, but a game in which Gus Edwards scored a touchdown, he got 7 fantasy points for teams. He had 9 carries for 11 yards. Now you're going to be limited somewhat. If you are being used in short yardage, the numbers are not going to look the same. But he's back to just being stuffed on basically every play. And then you only get extreme short yardage carries. You don't have the chance to even have, a 40, 50-yard game where you're like, that'd be 10 points. That'd be something if you score a touchdown. Now, if you play a weaker team, maybe you get multiple touchdowns. You have some different opportunities there. But Ben, I did want to ask you what you thought the upside for Kamani Vidal was in the passing game. I'm kind of looking at the SIS numbers. I know that PFF has some things that are at least slightly different, but in the 4 games that he was, more involved in there, 27 routes, which obviously in 4 games, not a huge number, has the 3 targets, gets the 49 receiving yards, actually has some air yards, which is interesting. But this is another situation where it would seem to me like the most likely thing is that he is back involved, but it's just to kind of paper over other deficiencies, and that this team is now Justin Herbert doing everything he can, trying to be Superman and carry them to the playoffs, which he may be able to do. He's playing very, very well.
Yeah, and that might be true. And that's probably the most likely outcome. And that essentially what you're saying is that no running back is playable. I still think Vidal is a clear target on waivers because you're talking about a situation where the team basically tipped their hand and made it pretty clear that they aren't going to use either of the other backs in more than very isolated usage. Like maybe Haskins will come on for long down and distance or like clear pass blocking situations, but I don't even know that they would do that because he's only, again, ran like 3 routes all season until this game. He was like the emergency Dobbins replacement that they never actually used as a Dobbins replacement. Vidal played in the pass game, as you said. Those 27 routes, it's not huge over 4 games. It's more than Gus Edwards has all year, and he's been active in more games. It's more than Haskins has all year, and he's been active basically every game. There's only been 3 backs active. This is why J.K. Dobbins has played every pass down, basically, is that they don't have another back that they trust. But Vidal, when they played him, first game, you mentioned the air yards, he has that wheel route touchdown. They only throw 3 passes to him over 4 games. His role shrunk across those 4 games, and Dobbins got more and more work, which is why I was like, he kind of missed his opportunity. But even by the final game, he got 5 touches in that game. He went 6 touches, 4 touches, 6 touches, 5 touches. That's not nothing. That's not Hassan Haskins playing 43% of the snaps and touching the ball 1 time. They were willing to use this player. I think it's pretty clear that as far as a player that they can put on the field and not tip their hand on whether they're going to run the ball or pass the ball, that Vital's the Dobbins handcuff. And then, yes, I do think you're right that like Edwards could have, I think you essentially talked through the scenarios where Edwards maybe could have 40 yards, multiple touchdowns. These are some like paths. Edwards is going to start. He's going to get the early down rushes, right? Early in the game in neutral situations. That's what's going to happen in the first game that Dobbins is out because he's the veteran. I think Vital's going to play 60% of the snaps or something like that. Now, is that an empty snap rate, which is sort of what you were asking me? And it's a concern. Like it could be like a Justice Hill where you're hoping on a few touches he does something meaningful. But snaps are one of the most predictive stats for running backs for scoring. I mean, just having a running back on the field a ton, you're going to get the ball some. Like Amir Abdullah had to play a 90% snap rate this last week for the Raiders because both Zamir White and Alexander Madison are out. He doesn't get a ton
Well, he
of
didn't
rushes.
have to, but they clearly think that Dylan Laube is just a special teams guy.
Sorry, didn't have to, but they pushed him into that role, and being out there on 90% of the snaps, he runs a bunch of routes. He ends up catching a touchdown on a little bit of a wheel route, catches a few other passes, gets like 8 carries. It was very much like we're going to be pass heavy. We're going to feature the downfield stuff. We're going to go after, Brock Bowers gets double teamed a bunch in this game. For anyone who was wondering why he had a down game, multiple targets where a second defender is coming in at the point of the target. Jacoby Myers
also interfering with him pretty frequently in the end zone, which makes it tougher.
Jacoby Myers has a great game as a result. 15 targets, 10 receptions. I wrote about a play where Bowers went into the flat and Surtain crashed down hard on him in the flat, and Myers was running a layered route above him about 10 yards downfield, and Minshew's like rolling out to that side. It's like a flood concept. And he's like, okay, well, yeah, I'll just throw to the wide open player further down the field, which like in hindsight, Surtain, you look at that, you think back, like he should probably take the deeper route in that spot. But they were so concerned with getting Bowers the ball in the flat there and then catch and run up the sideline that his obviously was coached to crash down on Bowers there, which left Myers wide. And so Myers has a great game in this game, in part because of the way Bowers was played, but they go very pass heavy.
It's an interesting one, I think, because it does sort of illustrate the different elements tactically that defenses are dealing with. And it also answers the question, at least to an extent, of why teams would allow Brock Bowers to do some of the things he's done to this point. Whereas you think about what the Seahawks did against the Cardinals, and like, we're not playing fantasy football. If you want to throw 15 passes to Trey McBride and we can take everybody else away, especially...
We'll beat you 16-6. We're going to win the game 16-6.
Especially if you make that fourth down. I mean, I gave the Cardinals a hard time about not going for it on fourth down. There's also the fourth down situation where you're thinking, okay, it's a turnover regardless. There is nothing that we can do that would be worse than simply not trying. Well, the one thing that is worse is throwing a pick six. So... I mean, you do get that element of the game as well, where if Kyler just eats that ball, maybe they stop the Seahawks because the Seahawks were also not doing anything. These were two to me, they're intriguing teams. I like both teams, have players on both teams that I'm very invested in for fantasy. And so you're watching this game with a lot of interest, and the Cardinals just seem like such a rising squad, especially with Kyler actually having played a good game before the bye, with how extremely successful their run concepts are. The fact that they have a Marvin Harrison who is trying to emerge in the second half, and then you have this just incredible force in Trey McBride. On the opposite side, you've got Mike McDonald and you've got your Husky coordinator, where the Seahawks seem like they could be a team where at any moment they take a massive jump. And with how tight the NFC West is, they could be NFC West champions. They could be a team a little bit like the Detroit Lions from last year, where if they get the things figured out, not only do they make the playoffs, but then in the playoffs, you don't want to play them. It's actually not very easy to tell which ones of those things are happening when you get this 16-6 game.
Yeah,
You're like, are the
because this is
Seahawks a rising defense? Is Kyler just reverting to form? Is the rising Cardinals defense? Because the Cardinals have had a lot of terrible peripherals, and yet you pointed out that they still are giving teams some trouble and giving them looks that opposing quarterbacks are sometimes making big mistakes on. And we had another play in this game. This game probably had the best image of the entire weekend, where Gino, like he's done sadly in some other games, extends a play and then in the red zone throws a bad pick because he felt like he had to do something. He initially didn't seem to understand what had happened, or at least was disappointed. You go through these different stages of like mini grief as a quarterback who's just thrown a red zone pick. Then he watches the play on the big screen, and when he sees what happens, he throws his head back in just utter dismay of like, how did I not see that guy? Because he had a better sense of where the defender had been after he rewatched it, which I think also gives us a little bit of insight as to what quarterbacks are actually going through, where when these plays happen very quickly, you're processing a ton of information. Even after you've thrown the pick, until you go and look at what actually happened, you don't even necessarily know what transpired on the play,
Yeah.
other than somebody appeared out of nowhere and picked off a ball that you thought was going to go to one of your teammates.
I think that's a great point. Some of the time, I also think because things are happening so quickly, you'll see them release the ball and immediately be like, "Oh crap, I shouldn't have thrown that pass," right? So you get both elements of it. But yeah, sometimes they don't even know it till after they see the replay. I want to wrap up several points because you had some. I want to talk about this Arizona Seattle game. It's a great one. The thing I was trying to say about how pass heavy the Raiders got, I wasn't getting to my point at all. But Abdullah winds up having a solid game in a situation where he just plays a high snap share, and they're clearly a pass focused offense because he's out there for so many snaps. That would be the upside for Kamani Vidal to circle back to, because they will be pass focused, but he should be out there for enough snaps. And they've shown a willingness to actually use him. It's not quite as empty of the snaps as Hassan Haskins played in this past game. And because of the Haskins and Edwards thing, I mean, unless they do something, very creative, as I wrote in signals that I'm not seeing, it would seem like the red carpet is rolled out for Vidal to be activated and used at a high rate. Again, like 50 to 60% snaps. So I do think he's worth picking up. To get back to this game, what you asked the question of like, is it the Cardinals or the Seahawks rising? And then talk about their defenses. The Cardinals defense has been better, and they were coming off a bye. 3 straight games now of holding defenses under, or opposing offenses under 300 yards. They had only done that once in the first 8 games. So the peripherals are bad, but a lot of that is pre-November. So since the calendar turned to November, they've been better, right? And then they just came off a bye. They're healthier. They do a good job in Seattle on the road. I'm getting more and more. They held the Bears. Bears aren't great, but held the Bears to 9. Jets aren't great either. Held them to 6. They just held Seattle to 16. Last 3 games, 31 total points against. Getting more and more impressed by.
And one of those again was just a defensive touchdown.
Yeah, exactly. The Seattle game. So the opposing offenses have scored single digits 3 games in a row against the Cardinals. That's not to say that the Cardinals defense is amazing. Those are bad offenses mostly, but it is to say that that's an impressive number. 3 straight single digit teams. And then Seattle's defense is the same situation, Sean, where they had only held one team under 300 total yards, or 2 teams. But it was weeks 1 and 3. Coming out of the gate, they had a good defensive plan, and then they got really bad in week 4 and got exposed a little bit. The next 6 games, 350 total yards allowed in every game, 360 total yards allowed in every game. And we all know that Seattle's defense looked really bad for that stretch. Came out of the bye, under 300 yards allowed to the 49ers, under 300 yards allowed to the Cardinals. Mike McDonald has talked about it a little bit, that like, it's not that this defense was broken. I don't think any of us thinks Mike McDonald is a bad coach because his defense played poorly for 6 games. I think we were all like, he's got new personnel. Teams have made some adjustments on the stuff that he tried to do in the first month, and they need to now have some things set in on the defensive side. He's got to coach it up a little bit. That was my perception of it, that it was a matter of time. It was an if not when. They come out of the bye and they look like that's the case. So I think this 16-6 game is a little bit of both defenses are playing better. It's not that the offenses weren't amazing or anything, or it's not that the offenses are perfect is what I was trying to say, right? Like that they don't have flaws, but I do think the defense is playing good football here. I agree with everything you were saying about the Seahawks and the Cardinals. The big thing for the Seahawks that I also wanted to throw in from this game. I mentioned Jackson Smith and Jigba earlier, but low A dot in this game, 7 targets, 6 catches, 77 yards in a TD. He breaks for a 46-yard catch and run on a wide receiver screen, ends up capping that drive with a touchdown in the short area where he gets open, right? And it's an easy throw and an easy catch and a touchdown. He also had a downfield catch of about 15 yards called back by a hold penalty. So the A dot being super low wouldn't have been that necessarily low if you consider this play that got called back by a penalty. But more importantly, we've seen over his last couple games that he's able to get open down the field, right? This showed us the other side of that. Where I was talking about, you want the production at all levels of the depth chart, right? Not depth chart. You want passes at all depths. You want to be able to get shallow targets because those are free points, right? Their high catch rate, their yak ability. You want to be able to get targets down the field. It's not what it was early last year with JSN, where it was all very low ADOT stuff. We've seen the last couple of weeks that he's been getting the downfield targets and he's been able to do it. And even in this game, as I said, he gets one play called back. And I consider the low ADOT touchdown catch of only a few yards more of a downfield pass than a 3-yard touchdown reception, because he has to go beat a guy in man coverage and get open, and he does it in a short area. Probably would have had more room to run, right? Like all these types of things. So I thought this was go ahead.
All of those things are hugely important.
Right.
You want to see the basically goal line designed to play for him. You want there to be touchdowns in his future in a variety of ways. They've targeted him in the end zone a decent amount on plays that just missed, some plays where he was pushed out the back of the end zone, that type of thing. But JSN right now looks like someone who could actually score quite a few touchdowns over the rest of the season, but certainly over the next 2 or 3 years. That part of it is incredibly important. You mentioned the vertical aspect that we saw a few weeks ago. That part is crucial, but that target floor in games where maybe those deep passes aren't there. One of the things that I read that I thought was interesting is that teams felt like the way opposing defenses were playing them, or specifically the Cardinals and their coaching staff, thought that the opposing defenses and the tendencies that they had in the upcoming schedule was going to allow for JSN to continue to get deep. I guess I was a little bit skeptical about that, in part because, teams are allowed to change what they do to take away the strengths of an opposing offense. But what you want to see is for that to not matter. You want there to be a target floor for the player. You want the player to be good before and after the catch. But we've now watched JSN run with the ball in a way that was completely missing last season. And that part was mystifying for me. I mean, certainly the fact that his ADOT was so low in 2023 was very frustrating, because he wasn't that type of limited guy at the college level. But given that, it was frustrating that he was not catching the ball and then breaking plays, because one of the things you go back and look at, and again, the season where he was dramatically, I wouldn't say better because they're different roles, but dramatically more productive than Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson. Part of it was that this run after the catch ability was crazy, right?
And he tested incredibly well. Super athletic. It's there.
And so you watch him as a rookie and you're like, what is happening? I mean, he catches the ball a yard across the line of scrimmage and the guy is on him and he goes down. Like, he's not separating a ton, even on these catches. And then because he hasn't separated and because he's not showing some kind of initial Christian McCaffrey-esque, and I mention McCaffrey all the time because they had the same agility testing that was off the charts. Where is that? Well,
it wasn't even there the first half of this year.
Yeah, exactly. I think with the Shane Waldron stuff, it's become, all of that has become more obvious, but then what he's done over the last month, where he's catching some of these passes middle of the field and then weaving through traffic, and you can see, and we've talked about this a little bit before in terms of the fire there, but the athletic ability and the competitiveness. A lot of the smaller receivers, and in some cases for very good reason, when they catch these balls over the middle or catch the ball and they have a defender coming up on them, they're going to go down to avoid an injury. You want to see the guys who are able to make people miss and turn a shorter play into a long play. And it's that entire mix of attributes with JSN that makes him so exciting for the future.
people talk about like the Debo role, and this isn't the Debo role the way that people like to talk about that. But the thing that makes the Debo role exciting is the mix of usage that you just talked about, and then the ball in hand ability that he actually does go get the yards, right? And this is what it's becoming. I loved the way that you put that in terms of in a game where you're not able to get the downfield stuff really going. The one catch you have downfield gets called back. You're not getting other targets downfield. There's still the floor of you, like you still get there. That's why I thought this 6 for 77 in a TD game was so important. And he wasn't doing this early in the year, Shawn. We talked at one point about him not being physical enough, not playing strong enough. And almost exactly after we started talking about that, I think it was after the Detroit game, maybe a few weeks back, he has been a different type of player for a few weeks. Was it the Detroit game was only week 4? Maybe it was even a couple weeks after that. But he has been a different type of player. And then he showed that when Metcalf was out, really. As soon as Metcalf got out a little bit, he had to put a little bit more on his back, and he showed certainly an ability to do that. They have a week 10 bye. They come out of the bye, and these 2 games have been so meaningful to me. And that with Metcalf back, it has looked more like for the pre-bye stuff and the pre-Metcalf injury stuff to me has looked like Metcalf is the centerpiece of this past game, and we're hoping JSN gets going alongside of it. And right now they are co-number ones, and JSN's probably better because the prospect profile is that good and the athleticism is that good. My input volatility piece over at the newsletter last week, Shawn, I did just a few of the top names, a little brief like rest of season tiered rankings thing for the subscribers. I put JSN 12th at the wide receiver position when I actually went there and lined up all the players, which is right behind some amazing players. Also ahead of T. Higgins and Garrett Wilson and Deebo Samuel and DK Metcalf and CeeDee Lamb. I had all those guys behind JSN. That's why I think it's important to emphasize even that what he has done early in 2024 is not what he is right now. What he is right now is something that is scratching the surface. You just said maybe he scores a lot of touchdowns the rest of the way. It's scratching the surface of that eruption now, right? Like this is now what we had been looking for a year and a half, that this is a good player with the prospect profile. He's going to be successful at the NFL level. But then you throw in the team context. You just talked about the Seattle's playing better football. They're leading the division. They're in a playoff chase right now. They're 6-5 and leading the division. They got to keep winning. They got 3 teams within 1 game of them in that division. They're going to push. They're going to push in ways that some of the matchups do actually lean towards JSN, and they're going to push in ways that lean toward the things that are working. And even Kenneth Walker right now isn't necessarily working well enough to be the focal point of this offense. I think he's going to have his moments going forward as well. DK Metcalf's going to have his moments, but it's 3 players, right? It's a very focused offense. Tyler Lockett's not even relevant at this point. The tight ends do a little bit here and there. Those guys are going to pop up now and then, but you do have a hyper-focused offense that can produce yards and score points, has some pretty good upcoming matchups, some situations where they should be able to do some things. And this is a player that, in my opinion, the wide receiver 12 ranking was prior to last week, but I go see this game here where the Seahawks offense doesn't do much, and DK Metcalf does get completely shut down, and Kenneth Walker does get completely shut down, more or less. He does some stuff in the past game. He ends up with over 90 total yards. He didn't get completely shut down. But JSN is able to come out with a 77-yard and a TD game. They have under 300 total yards of offense. And the different ways that he can produce. And at this point, to me, there's not that many wide receivers I'd rather have on any of my rosters and in any of my lineups, because I feel confident he's going to impact the game across 4 quarters in some way. That's what we're talking about. They're going to get him going in some way. If it's not happening down the field, they'll do it closer to the line of scrimmage. He's a very impactful player right now for a team that's got to compete and is going forward and going to try to compete. And then there's upside that he just continues to erupt. Like, we don't know what his ceiling is. He's just scratching that surface. He could be a top 3 wide receiver for the rest of the season. I mean, he could completely take the top off this 2024 season. He's a really exciting player, at this moment.
And while there's still perhaps, tiny volume concerns in terms of Metcalf and Walker being offensive focal points, it's also the case where a lot of opposing defenses are probably going to still try and take those guys away, which frees him up. It's fascinating every week, I think, to look at Walker. I have him written up in the 0 RB universe as his games are just bizarre compared to everybody else. Then he converts a first down on 3 of his 4 receptions. He evades 5 tackles. He gains 28 yards after contact. He has an 18-10 routes lead on Charbonnet, who didn't draw a target. You get him anything to work with, and he does something. He evaded 4 more tackles as a runner. So 9 evaded tackles total on the day. Again, the way SIS charts it especially, those numbers are very unique. 36 of 41 yards after contact as a runner. Also, and I don't think this will surprise anybody, led the league with 6 stuffs. The receiving game is pretty interesting because mostly his ability to evade tackles then manifests in yardage, first downs, all those types of things. A lot of his evaded tackles as a runner do simply lead to him being tackled behind the line of scrimmage somewhere else on the field later in the play. So you have to keep those kinds of things in mind. The Seahawks basically have no running game because for whatever reason, and part of it I think is just mostly offensive line play, Ryan Grubb hasn't figured out how to sync those parts. They haven't been able to create space for the running backs. When you have Kenneth Walker as fantasy starter, and you're excited for the points, you're excited for the receiving role, you're excited for the talent, you're kind of hoping too that this is slow work in progress, and maybe we're going to see the offense take the kind of jump that you described for the defense. If they would actually be able to run the ball a little bit, again, maybe that takes away from what we're looking for from Metcalf and JSN, but maybe it amplifies it. So the final, really almost half, but third of the season for the Seahawks is going to be one of the most meaningful, I think, from a reality perspective. You just described where the NFC West is, but also from a fantasy perspective, and not just for this year, because the Seahawks have dynasty pieces that are incredibly important. We discussed where some of these guys would go next year in our ADP projection, and both Walker and JSN are tricky. We kind of talked about JSN at the 2-3 turn. I think some listeners are going to be skeptical about that, but certainly, you just put him that high basically in your input volatility post that you wrote. But then you get this game and you think about what could happen the rest of the way. Part of what we're doing in that show is talking about guys that we think we're going to blow up. And McBride is interesting too. And I put him in the middle of the second round. If you had just looked at his fantasy points to, the point in which we recorded the show, people are going to be like, no, you guys just like Trey McBride. Some of these guys are going to have big final halves of the season.